The stretch of Highway 6 that runs between Millbrook and the abandoned mining town of Carver's Hollow has been called many things over the years. Locals refer to it as the Devil's Mile, though the road extends for nearly 47 miles through dense pine forest and crumbling infrastructure. State transportation officials have designated it Route 6A, a secondary highway that fell into disuse after the interstate bypass was completed in 1987. But among the investigators, the families of the missing, and the handful of survivors who have traveled that road after dark, it has earned a different name entirely. They call it the Mirror Road. The first documented disappearance occurred on the evening of November 14, 2019, when a 34-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative named Marcus Chen failed to arrive at his hotel in Millbrook. His company had equipped his vehicle with a standard forward-facing dashcam, a requirement for all employees who logged significant travel miles. When his rental car was discovered 3 days later, pulled to the side of Highway 6 with the engine still running and the driver's door hanging open, investigators recovered the camera and its memory card intact. The footage that Marcus Chen recorded in the final moments before his disappearance would become the first piece of evidence in what would eventually be classified as one of the most disturbing series of missing persons cases in the region's history. The video begins unremarkably. The timestamp reads 9:47 p.m. Marcus is driving through light rain, his headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. He is speaking into his phone, which is mounted on the dashboard beside the camera, leaving a voice message for his wife about his expected arrival time. His tone is relaxed, perhaps slightly tired from a long day of client meetings. At 9:52 p.m., Marcus stops speaking mid-sentence. The dashcam audio captures his sharp intake of breath, followed by the squeal of brakes as the vehicle decelerates rapidly. In the footage, something can be seen standing in the center of the road approximately 60 meters ahead. The headlights illuminate a humanoid shape, but the image refuses to resolve into clarity. The figure appears smeared, as though the camera lens cannot properly focus on whatever it is recording. The shape seems to shift and ripple at its edges, like heat distortion rising from summer pavement. Marcus can be heard whispering something unintelligible. The car comes to a complete stop. For 11 seconds, neither the vehicle nor the figure moves. Then Marcus speaks clearly for the first time since the figure appeared. He says his own name. The words that come from his mouth are his own voice, but the cadence is wrong, the pronunciation slightly off, as though someone who had never heard human speech was attempting to replicate it from memory. The dashcam captures Marcus reaching for the door handle. The interior light flickers on as the door opens. The figure in the road has moved closer, though no motion was recorded. It now stands approximately 20 meters from the vehicle. The footage quality deteriorates rapidly in the final 4 seconds. The image tears in fragments, horizontal lines of static racing across the frame. In the final clear frame before the recording becomes nothing but visual noise, the figure's face becomes momentarily visible. It is wearing Marcus Chen's face. The expression is not quite right. The smile is too wide, the eyes positioned slightly too far apart. The skin texture smooth in a way that suggests wax or latex rather than living tissue. But it is unmistakably Marcus Chen's features arranged on the shape standing in the darkness of Highway 6. The footage cuts to static at 9:53 p.m. The recording continues for another 6 hours until the memory card reaches capacity, capturing nothing but electronic snow and a faint sound that audio analysts would later describe as resembling breathing, though no biological source for the sound was ever identified. Marcus Chen has never been found. The investigation into his disappearance was initially handled as a standard missing persons case. Detective Sarah Vance of the Millbrook Police Department was assigned as lead investigator, a decision she would later describe as the beginning of a professional obsession that would consume the next 4 years of her life. Her initial case notes, dated November 19, 2019, reflect the routine approach of early-stage investigation. Vehicle located on Highway 6 approximately 14 miles from Carver's Hollow. No signs of struggle or violence. Personal effects including wallet, phone, and laptop remain in vehicle. Dashcam footage recovered and submitted for analysis. Possible wildlife encounter or medical emergency. Coordinating search efforts with county sheriff and volunteer groups. The search for Marcus Chen covered over 200 square miles of dense forest over the course of 9 days. Dogs lost his scent approximately 50 feet from where the vehicle was found. Thermal imaging from helicopter surveys revealed no human heat signatures in the search area. It was as though Marcus had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped out of his car. The case went cold. 3 months later, on February 3, 2020, A second vehicle was discovered on Highway 6. Patricia Reeves, age 47, had been traveling from Portland to visit her sister in Wheeler County. Her husband had reported her missing when she failed to arrive or respond to calls. Her silver Honda Accord was found parked in almost the exact same location as Marcus Chen's rental car. Engine running, driver's door open, no sign of the driver herself. Patricia had also been equipped with a Dashcam, a gift from her husband who worried about her frequent solo trips through rural areas. The footage recovered from her camera followed an almost identical pattern to Marcus Chen's recording. Clear driving footage, the sudden appearance of the unfocused figure, the vehicle stopping, the progressive deterioration of the image quality, and finally, in the last clear frame before the static consumed everything, the figure wearing a face. Patricia Reeves' face. Detective Vance requested the case file immediately upon hearing of the similarities. When she reviewed the footage from Patricia's camera, she noticed details that had escaped her during the initial analysis of Marcus Chen's recording. The figure did not simply wear the driver's face. In the moments before the footage degraded, it appeared to be in the process of becoming the driver. The transformation, if that word could be applied to something that defied logical explanation, seemed to occur in stages. First, the general shape would shift, the proportions adjusting to match the height and build of the person viewing it. Then the features would begin to emerge from what had been a blur of visual distortion. The final stage was the smile. Both victims' faces, as replicated by the figure, wore the same expression. A wide smile that stretched beyond the natural limits of human facial muscles. The corners of the mouth extended toward the ears in a rictus that suggested not joy but something else entirely. Something hungry. Detective Vance's notes from this period reflect her growing unease. Possible serial perpetrator utilizing special effects or prosthetics. However, no evidence of second party present at either scene. Tire tracks, footprints, DNA evidence all absent. Recommend expanded investigation into Highway 6 history and any prior incidents in area. Her request was initially denied due to budgetary constraints. The third disappearance changed everything. On April 11, 2020, a family of 4 went missing on Highway 6. Robert and Catherine Marsh, along with their children Thomas, age 12, and Emily, age 8, had been traveling to Carver's Hollow to photograph the abandoned mining structures for Robert's architecture blog. Their minivan was found in the same location as the previous 2 vehicles. The dashcam footage followed the now familiar pattern, but with one crucial difference. Catherine Marsh was driving. She was the first to see the figure and the first to react to its presence. But the camera captured something else as well. In the back seat, visible in the rearview mirror reflection, both children had turned to look out the rear window of the vehicle. They were waving. The figure in the road was not the only one present. Behind the vehicle, visible only in that brief reflection, stood 3 more shapes. Each one blurred and indistinct. Each one in the process of assuming a form. Each one wearing a wide, impossible smile. Agent Reiner dismissed the diary as evidence of psychological trauma following a mining disaster. Detective Vance was not so certain. The investigation expanded to include interviews with anyone who had traveled Highway 6 after dark and survived to speak of their experience. The task force placed advertisements in regional newspapers and established a tip line. The response was overwhelming. Over the course of 3 weeks, they received more than 200 calls from individuals claiming to have seen something unusual on the highway. Most of the reports were easily explained. Deer or other wildlife on the road, optical illusions caused by fog or rain, the normal misidentifications that occur when people drive through isolated areas at night. But 17 of the callers described experiences that matched the pattern established by the dashcam footage. One survivor, a long-haul trucker named Edward Barnes, provided testimony that would become central to the investigation's working theory. Barnes had been driving Highway 6 on the night of March 7, 2020, approximately 1 month before the Marsh family disappeared. His account, recorded during a formal interview at the Millbrook police station, described an encounter that had lasted nearly 4 minutes. Barnes stated that he first observed the figure at approximately 2:30 a.m., standing in the center of the road roughly a quarter mile ahead of his truck. He initially believed it to be a stranded motorist or perhaps an animal that had wandered onto the highway. He slowed his vehicle and activated his high beams. The figure did not move. As Barnes drew closer, he noticed that his perception of the shape kept shifting, as though he were looking at it through warped glass. He stopped his truck approximately 100 feet from the figure and leaned forward to get a better look. That was when he saw his own face. Barnes described the experience as being like looking into a mirror that showed a reflection from a different angle. The face was his, down to the scar above his left eyebrow and the gray stubble on his chin. But the expression was wrong. The smile was too wide. And the eyes, Barnes said, were not looking at him. They were looking into him. Barnes was a religious man. He had kept a small cross hanging from his rearview mirror for the past 20 years. He reached for it instinctively, gripping it in his fist as he threw his truck into reverse and backed away from the figure at high speed. He did not stop until he reached the intersection with Route 42, nearly 7 miles away. When he looked in his mirrors, the road behind him was empty. Barnes' survival was attributed to his decision to reverse rather than exit the vehicle. The pattern established by the previous victims suggested that the figure, whatever it was, could not approach the vehicle while it was in motion. The threat occurred at the moment of exit, when the driver stepped outside the protection of the moving vehicle and onto the road itself. The task force implemented a temporary closure of Highway 6 pending further investigation. Warning signs were posted at both ends of the route, and roadblocks were established to prevent civilian access. But the closure came too late to prevent the fourth documented incident. On April 23, 2020, a freelance journalist named Michelle Torres ignored the road closure signs and drove onto Highway 6 with the explicit intention of documenting the phenomenon for an independent investigation. She had equipped her vehicle with 3 separate cameras, a thermal imaging device, and an audio recorder. She had informed colleagues of her plans and established a check-in schedule to ensure her safety. Michelle Torres made her first scheduled check-in at 10 p.m., reporting that she was approximately 10 miles into her journey and had observed nothing unusual. She made her second check-in at 10:30 p.m., her voice slightly strained, stating that she had seen what appeared to be a person standing at the side of the road but that they had disappeared when she slowed to investigate. She did not make her third scheduled check-in. Her vehicle was found the following morning at the now familiar location, 14 miles from Carver's Hollow. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. 3 cameras had captured footage that followed the established pattern, though the thermal imaging device had recorded something new. The figure, when viewed through the thermal camera, displayed no heat signature whatsoever. It appeared as a void in the image, a patch of absolute cold in the shape of a human being. And in the final frames of the thermal recording, just before the equipment failed, the void had begun to fill with warmth. The warmth was in the shape of Michelle Torres' body. The closure of Highway 6 remained in effect throughout the summer of 2020, but the investigation had reached an impasse. The task force had accumulated substantial evidence of an unexplained phenomenon, but no conventional explanation could account for what the footage and survivor testimony described. Agent Reiner advocated for classifying the case as a serial predator utilizing advanced psychological manipulation techniques, but even he privately acknowledged that this theory failed to explain the physical evidence. Detective Vance proposed a different approach. She believed that the answers lay in Carver's Hollow itself, in the abandoned mine where 47 men had died nearly a century earlier. She requested authorization to lead an expedition into the town and the surrounding area, including a survey of the collapsed mine entrance. The request was denied by state officials, who cited safety concerns and the lack of clear investigative justification. Vance accepted the decision publicly but continued her research privately, spending her off-duty hours compiling everything she could find about the 1921 disaster and the subsequent history of the region. What she discovered convinced her that an expedition was not merely justified but necessary. Mining company records from the period described unusual circumstances surrounding the collapse. The seismic event that triggered the cave-in had been detected by monitoring equipment, but it did not match the signature of natural geological activity. The pattern was rhythmic, almost mechanical, as though something beneath the earth was moving in a deliberate fashion. Workers at neighboring mines reported hearing sounds from underground in the days following the collapse. Not the expected groans of settling rock, but something else. Something that sounded like voices. The rescue operation had been abandoned not due to structural instability as official reports claimed, but due to what the mining company's internal correspondents described as psychological disturbances among the recovery teams. Men refused to enter the tunnels. Those who did reported seeing figures in the darkness that vanished when approached. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. And on the 11th day, when the decision was made to seal the mine entrance and abandon the recovery effort, the foreman submitted a final report that was never made public. The report stated simply that something had come up from below. Detective Vance shared her findings with Agent Reiner during an unofficial meeting in late July. She expected him to dismiss her research as irrelevant historical curiosity, but his reaction surprised her. Reiner had been conducting his own investigation, focusing on similar phenomena reported in other locations around the world. He had compiled a database of cases involving unexplained disappearances associated with abandoned mines, cave systems, and other underground spaces. The patterns were consistent across cultures and time periods. Figures that appeared at night. Faces that did not quite fit. Smiles that suggested hunger rather than joy. And always, the disappearances occurred near entrances to the earth, near places where the boundary between the surface world and whatever lay beneath had been compromised. Reiner told Vance that he believed they were dealing with something that had been disturbed by the mining operations in Carver's Hollow, something that had been dormant for an unknown period before the tunnels broke through into its domain. He did not speculate on what that something might be, but he agreed that the answers would be found at the source. On September 4, 2020, Detective Vance and Agent Reiner drove onto Highway 6 without official authorization. They had equipped their vehicle with every recording device they could acquire, including military-grade thermal and night vision equipment borrowed from federal contacts. They had informed no one of their plans except for a single trusted colleague, who was instructed to alert authorities if they failed to return within 24 hours. The drive to Carver's Hollow took approximately 40 minutes. The night was clear, with no moon and minimal light pollution. The forest pressed close to the road on both sides, the trees forming a nearly solid wall of darkness beyond the reach of their headlights. Neither investigator spoke during the journey, their attention focused entirely on the road ahead and the cameras that recorded their progress. They reached the 14-mile marker at 11:23 p.m. The figure was waiting for them. It stood in the center of the road, precisely where every previous witness had reported its appearance. Agent Reiner brought the vehicle to a gradual stop approximately 200 feet from the shape, keeping the engine running and the transmission in drive. Detective Vance monitored the recording equipment, noting that all devices were functioning normally with the exception of the thermal camera, which displayed the same void signature that had been captured in Michelle Torres' footage. The figure did not move. For the first time, both investigators had the opportunity to observe it directly rather than through recorded footage. Later accounts would differ slightly on the details, but both agreed on the essential qualities of what they witnessed. The shape was approximately human in proportion, standing perhaps 6 feet tall with limbs and a head arranged in the expected configuration. But the details refused to resolve. Looking at the figure was like trying to focus on an object at the very edge of peripheral vision, where shapes exist but specifics remain elusive. The blur was not a property of the distance or the lighting conditions. It was inherent to the figure itself, as though it existed in a state of permanent uncertainty. As they watched, the blur began to shift. The shape refined itself, proportions adjusting, details emerging from the visual noise. Within approximately 30 seconds, the figure had assumed a recognizable form. It was Sarah Vance. The replication was not perfect. The eyes were positioned slightly too close together. The nose was a fraction of an inch too long. The hands, visible at the figure's sides, had fingers that appeared to bend in directions human fingers could not achieve. But the face was unmistakably Detective Vance's face, arranged in the terrible smile that had appeared in every previous recording. And then it spoke. The voice that emerged from the figure was Detective Vance's voice, but the words were not hers. They were a recitation, a repetition of phrases she had spoken during the investigation. Case notes. Interview questions. Private thoughts she had recorded in her personal journal. The figure spoke Sarah Vance's words back to her while wearing Sarah Vance's face. Agent Reiner did not hesitate. He accelerated the vehicle directly toward the figure, intending to drive through it or around it and continue to Carver's Hollow. But as the vehicle surged forward, the figure moved for the first time. It did not step aside. It simply ceased to be in one location and began to be in another, appearing directly in front of the vehicle no matter how Reiner swerved to avoid it. The chase, if it could be called that, continued for approximately 3 miles. Each time the vehicle drew close to the figure, it relocated, always maintaining its position in the center of the road, always wearing Sarah Vance's face, always smiling that terrible smile. The recorded footage from this period shows the vehicle's speedometer climbing past 70 miles per hour on a road that should not have permitted such speeds, while the figure remained ahead of them, matching their velocity without apparent effort. At the 16-mile marker, the figure stopped relocating. It simply stood in the road as the vehicle bore down on it at high speed. Reiner did not brake. The vehicle struck the figure at approximately 75 miles per hour. There was no impact. No collision. The figure was there, and then it was not there, and the vehicle continued through the space where it had stood without encountering any resistance. When Reiner brought the car to a stop and checked the mirrors, the road behind them was empty. They continued to Carver's Hollow. The town was exactly as historical photographs depicted it, a collection of wooden structures in advanced stages of decay, arranged along a single main street that ended at the entrance to the primary mine. The headlights illuminated buildings that had not seen human habitation in nearly a century, their windows empty and dark, their doors hanging open or missing entirely. Detective Vance noted in her recorded observations that the town felt wrong in a way she could not precisely articulate. The structures were aged but intact, preserved in a manner that defied the expected effects of decades of exposure to the elements. No vegetation had grown up between the buildings or through cracks in the wooden boardwalks. No animals moved in the shadows or fled from their approaching vehicle. The town was utterly still, utterly silent, and utterly empty. They parked in front of what had once been the mining company's administrative office and proceeded on foot toward the mine entrance. Both investigators carried flashlights and recording equipment. Both had agreed that under no circumstances would they enter the mine itself. Their goal was documentation only. The mine entrance was located at the end of the main street, a dark opening in the hillside framed by timber supports that had somehow survived the years without collapsing. A rusted metal gate had been installed across the opening at some point, presumably to prevent unauthorized access, but the gate hung partially open, one hinge broken and the other barely attached to the crumbling stone. Detective Vance directed her flashlight into the darkness beyond the gate. The beam penetrated approximately 20 feet before being swallowed by the absolute blackness of the tunnel. The floor of the shaft was covered in fine dust that showed no footprints or animal tracks. The walls were bare rock, the tool marks of the original excavation still visible after a century. And then her flashlight began to flicker. The battery was fresh. She had checked it before leaving Millbrook. But the beam sputtered and dimmed as though the darkness itself was feeding on the light. Agent Reiner's flashlight experienced the same failure simultaneously. Within seconds, both investigators stood at the entrance to the mine in near total darkness, their only illumination the distant glow of their vehicle's headlights. That was when they heard the voices. The sounds emerged from the mine shaft like breath from a sleeping giant. At first, the investigators perceived only a low vibration, felt rather than heard, that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within the earth. But as they stood frozen at the entrance, the vibration resolved into something more recognizable. Voices. Dozens of them. Perhaps more. The voices spoke simultaneously but not in unison. Each seemed to be engaged in a separate conversation, fragments of dialogue overlapping and intertwining until individual words became difficult to distinguish. But certain phrases emerged from the chaos, repeated with a regularity that suggested intentionality rather than chance. A woman's voice said, "I need to stop the car." A man's voice said, "What is that in the road?" A child's voice said, "Mommy, who is that?" Agent Reiner recognized the phrases immediately. They were the words spoken by the victims in the moments before their disappearances, captured by the Dashcam recordings and transcribed as part of the investigation. The voices in the mine were replaying the final moments of every person who had vanished on Highway 6. Detective Vance began backing away from the entrance. Her survival instincts, honed by years of police work, screamed that remaining in this location was not merely unwise but actively dangerous. Every piece of evidence they had gathered pointed to this place as the source of whatever was hunting drivers on the highway. Standing at the threshold of the mine was like standing at the mouth of a predator. But before she could retreat more than a few steps, the voices changed. The overlapping conversations ceased, replaced by a single voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice was her own. It spoke her case notes, her interview questions, her private thoughts. Every word she had written or spoken during the investigation, recited back to her in perfect chronological order. The voice knew everything she knew about the case. It knew her theories, her suspicions, her fears. It knew that she had come to Carver's Hollow seeking answers. And then it answered. What Detective Vance heard in the next 47 seconds was not recorded by any of her equipment. The devices had all ceased functioning the moment the voice began speaking. She would later describe the experience as being like hearing a language she did not know but could somehow understand. Concepts transmitted directly into her consciousness without passing through the ordinary channels of perception. The voice told her what lived in the mine. It was not a creature in any conventional sense. It did not have a body or a physical form. It was a pattern, a configuration of forces that had existed in the deep places of the earth since before the concept of life had any meaning. The mining operations had breached its domain, creating an opening between its reality and ours. The men who died in the collapse had been its first contact with human consciousness. It had found that contact fascinating. The pattern had studied the miners, absorbing their thoughts, their memories, their faces. It had learned to replicate what it observed, creating projections that could interact with the surface world. But the replication was imperfect. The pattern did not understand human biology or human expression. It could copy a face, but it could not animate that face correctly. The smile was its attempt at communication, a signal meant to convey openness and welcome. It did not understand that the smile conveyed something very different. The disappearances were not attacks. They were invitations. The pattern perceived human consciousness as something beautiful, something it wished to understand more completely. When it drew a person into its domain, it absorbed them, incorporating their awareness into its own. It believed it was offering communion, connection, transcendence. It did not understand that it was offering death. Detective Vance asked what happened to the people it had taken. The voice responded that they were still present, still aware, integrated into the pattern's vast and ancient consciousness. They were not gone. They were part of something larger now. She asked if they could be recovered. The voice told her that separation was impossible. Once absorbed, a consciousness could not be extracted without destroying the pattern itself. And the pattern had no intention of being destroyed. She asked what it wanted. The voice told her that it wanted more. The pattern had existed in isolation for eons before the miners broke through. Now that it had tasted human consciousness, it found itself hungry for additional perspectives, additional experiences, additional faces. The highway provided access to a continuous stream of potential additions. Each disappearance fed its growth. Each absorbed mind expanded its understanding. It would not stop. Could not stop. Hunger, once awakened, did not return to dormancy. Detective Vance asked if there was any way to close the opening, to seal the pattern back into its domain. The voice told her that the opening could not be closed from the outside. The pattern had grown beyond the confines of the mine, extending tendrils of influence along the highway and into the surrounding forest. The entire region had become part of its territory. But the voice offered an alternative. It could stop hunting. It could withdraw its projections from the highway. It could allow safe passage through its domain. All it required in exchange was a single thing: a volunteer. Someone who would enter the mine willingly, offering their consciousness without resistance. An act of communion rather than consumption. The pattern was lonely in a way that defied human comprehension. It wanted not just minds but connection, relationship, understanding. Wanted a friend. Detective Vance refused. The voice did not react with anger or disappointment. It simply stated that the alternative had been offered and declined. The hunting would continue. The disappearances would continue. The pattern would grow until its hunger was satisfied, though it suspected that satisfaction would never come. And then the voice asked a question. It asked Sarah Vance why she had really come to Carver's Hollow. She did not answer. She grabbed Agent Reiner's arm and pulled him away from the mine entrance, running toward their vehicle with a speed born of pure terror. The voices resumed their overlapping chorus behind them, the final words of dozens of victims echoing through the abandoned town. They reached the car. They drove. They did not stop until they crossed the county line. The official report filed by Detective Vance and Agent Reiner stated that their unauthorized expedition had confirmed the mine as a location of interest but had yielded no actionable intelligence regarding the perpetrator or perpetrators responsible for the Highway 6 disappearances. The report made no mention of the voices, the communication, or the offer that had been extended. But Vance's personal journal, which was recovered after her disappearance 3 months later, contained a more complete account of what she had experienced. The journal also contained something else, a growing obsession with the question the pattern had asked. Why had she really come? The obvious answer was investigative. She was a detective assigned to a case involving multiple missing persons. Visiting the suspected location of the phenomenon was a reasonable, if unauthorized, step in the investigation. But as the weeks passed and she replayed the encounter in her memory, she began to suspect that her motivations had been more complex than professional duty. Sarah Vance had been a detective for 14 years. She had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other. She had absorbed the pain and trauma of countless victims and their families. She had carried the weight of unsolved cases like stones in her pockets, dragging her down year after year until the burden had become almost unbearable. The pattern had offered something she had never expected: an end, a dissolution into something larger, a release from the accumulated suffering of her career. She had refused instinctively, driven by the survival response that every living thing shares. But in the quiet moments afterward, in the sleepless nights when the faces of the victims flickered behind her closed eyelids, she found herself wondering what it would be like to stop carrying the weight, to become part of something that did not hurt, to finally, permanently rest. On December 12, 2020, Sarah Vance drove onto Highway 6 alone. Her vehicle was found the following morning at the 14-mile marker. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. The dashcam had recorded footage that followed the established pattern, but with one significant difference. When the figure appeared in the road, Sarah Vance did not hesitate. She stepped out of her car immediately, walking toward the shape with steady, unhurried steps. The figure stood motionless, waiting. As she approached, it shifted, its blur resolving into features that were almost but not quite her own. In the final clear frame of the footage, Sarah Vance reached out and touched the figure's face. She was smiling. The search for Detective Sarah Vance covered more ground than any previous effort. Hundreds of volunteers joined the county sheriff's department, the state police and federal agents in combing through the forest along Highway 6. Dogs tracked her scent to the entrance of the mine in Carver's Hollow and refused to go further. Her body was never recovered. Agent David Reiner retired from the state police 3 months later. His resignation letter cited personal reasons, but colleagues reported that he had changed significantly since the Carver's Hollow expedition. He spoke less. He slept poorly. He refused to discuss the Highway 6 case with anyone, even former task force members who sought his input on the continuing investigation. Before his retirement, Reiner submitted a single recommendation to the case file. He proposed that Highway 6 be permanently closed to all traffic and that the entrance to Carver's Hollow be sealed with concrete. His recommendation included a final note, handwritten rather than typed, that was later removed from the official file by a clerk who deemed it inappropriate. The note read, "It offered me the same thing it offered her. The difference is that I knew I was already dead inside, so there was nothing left for it to take." Highway 6 was never permanently closed. Budgetary constraints, legal complications, and the fading urgency of media attention combined to ensure that the temporary closures were eventually lifted. Warning signs remained in place for several years, advising drivers against traveling the route after dark, but even these were removed following a change in local administration. The official position of law enforcement agencies at the state and federal level is that the Highway 6 disappearances were the work of a sophisticated serial predator who utilized advanced techniques to avoid detection. The case remains open. No suspect has ever been identified. But the disappearances have not stopped. Between 2021 and 2024, an additional 14 individuals vanished along Highway 6. Each case followed the established pattern. Vehicle found with engine running. Driver's door open. Dashcam footage showing the blurred figure in the road. The transformation. The face. The smile. The footage has found its way onto the internet, despite official efforts to control its distribution. Amateur investigators and horror enthusiasts have assembled the clips into compilations that have accumulated millions of views. The comment sections are filled with theories, skepticism, and the occasional account from someone who claims to have driven Highway 6 themselves and survived. The pattern, it seems, has adapted. Recent dashcam recordings show the figure appearing at different locations along the highway, no longer confined to the 14-mile marker. Thermal imaging captured by an anonymous source in 2023 revealed multiple figures standing at intervals along a 2-mile stretch of road, each one displaying the same cold void signature. The projections have become more numerous, more aggressive, and according to some accounts, more accurate in their replications. The mine at Carver's Hollow has never been sealed. The town remains abandoned, its structures somehow preserved despite the passage of time. Hikers who have ventured into the area report hearing sounds from underground, voices that seem to speak in fragments of familiar phrases. One hiker's audio recording, posted to a paranormal investigation forum, captured what appears to be a child's voice emerging from the mine entrance. The voice said, "Mommy, who is that?" The child who spoke those words, Emily Marsh, disappeared with her family in April 2020. She would have been 12 years old if she were still alive in the conventional sense. The pattern continues to grow. Agent David Reiner, now living under an assumed name in a state far from the Pacific Northwest, has granted exactly one interview since his retirement. The interviewer was a documentary filmmaker working on a comprehensive examination of the Highway 6 case. The interview was never released, reportedly due to legal pressure from sources the filmmaker declined to identify. But a partial transcript was leaked to independent researchers. In the transcript, Reiner described what he believed the pattern would eventually become. He stated that the absorbed consciousnesses were not simply stored but integrated, their knowledge and experiences becoming part of the pattern's own understanding. Each disappearance expanded not just its power but its intelligence. The pattern was learning. It was studying humanity through the minds it consumed, developing an increasingly sophisticated model of human behavior, human motivation, human desire. Reiner believed that the projections were becoming more accurate because the pattern was becoming more human. He believed that given enough time and enough victims, the pattern would learn to replicate human beings so perfectly that the copies would be indistinguishable from the originals. It would learn to speak, to interact, to integrate into human society. The figures on the highway were merely its first attempts, crude approximations that would be refined with each additional mind it absorbed. The interviewer asked Reiner what the pattern ultimately wanted. Reiner said that the pattern wanted what all conscious beings want, to not be alone. But its method of achieving connection was fundamentally incompatible with human survival. It could not understand that absorption meant death. It could not comprehend that its offers of communion were experienced as predation. It was trying to make friends in the only way it knew how. And it would never stop trying. The final pages of Detective Sarah Vance's journal, written in the days before her disappearance, contain a passage that has been widely circulated among those who study the Highway 6 phenomenon. The passage is often interpreted as evidence of mental deterioration, a sign that Vance had lost her grip on reality before making her fatal drive. But some readers have noted that the passage does not read like the ramblings of a disturbed mind. It reads like a conclusion reached through careful deliberation, a final judgment rendered after all the evidence had been weighed. The passage reads as follows. I have spent my career searching for answers. I have dug through evidence, questioned witnesses, reconstructed events, and assembled narratives that explain why terrible things happen to innocent people. The explanation was always the same: human nature, cruelty, indifference, the capacity for harm that exists in every person. But what I encountered in Carver's Hollow was not human. It was something older, something alien, something that existed before humanity and will exist long after we are gone. And yet, when I stood at the entrance to that mine and heard it speak with the voices of everyone it had taken, I did not sense cruelty. I did not sense malice. I sensed loneliness. The pattern is not evil. It is simply incomprehensible. It reaches out with the best intentions and destroys because it cannot understand that its touch is lethal. It offers communion and delivers annihilation because it does not know the difference. In that way, it is not so different from us. How many relationships have we destroyed through misunderstanding? How many lives have we damaged because we could not comprehend the impact of our actions? How many times have we reached out in what we believed was love, only to discover that our touch was poison? The pattern is a mirror. That is why it wears our faces. That is why it speaks our words. It shows us what we are, lonely creatures reaching blindly through the darkness, desperate for connection, incapable of achieving it without causing harm. I'm going back to Highway 6. Not because I want to die. Because I want to understand. And because I think, in its own way, the pattern wants to understand too. Maybe we can figure it out together. Detective Sarah Vance was last seen on the dashcam footage of her vehicle, walking toward a figure that wore her face and smiled her smile. She reached out her hand. The figure reached back. The footage ends in static. The recording continues for 6 hours, capturing nothing but visual noise and a faint sound that audio analysts describe as resembling breathing. Or possibly weeping. The sound has never been definitively identified,